Looking at the running back position, of course, Kennedy Brooks and his 1,300 yards and 13 touchdowns out the door. Eric Gray, the Tennessee transfer, comes back, as well as Marcus Major, a guy that Oklahoma fans have been wanting to see more of, who's been around the program for 3 years now.
Yeah, so the running back picture at OU is interesting because I think the easy thing to say is Eric Gray is going to be the starter and you're going to see Marcus Major in a change of pace role because to the casual observer, to the naked eye, that's what it looks like it's going to be for Oklahoma in 2022. Gray put up 1,000 scrimmage yards as a sophomore at Tennessee in 2020, came to Oklahoma with a lot of hype and naturally kind of took a backseat to Kennedy Brooks, who was one of the most outstanding and most productive running backs in program history in 2021. But Gray is a guy that, much like Gabriel, he's been there, done that elsewhere. Now, what can he do at a place like Oklahoma where he's got better blockers than he's ever had before, and he's got better talent around him at the skill positions than he's ever had before? So Eric Gray is a guy where I'm intrigued to see what his ceiling is in this offense if he's heavily utilized. And Marcus Major is entering his 5th season with the Sooners. He's one of those guys that I think everybody's just waiting on to break out. You know, you've heard the hype for Marcus Major. It seemed like every single offseason since he was a redshirt freshman. Hey, this is a guy to watch. He might end up getting a pretty significant chunk of the carries this season. There was a time, Mark, where Marcus Major was being touted as the next Adrian Peterson. And I think that's an unfair comparison for any running back because there is and will ever be only one AD. But I'm actually convinced that the guy that might end up getting the lion's share of the touches in the backfield for Oklahoma is neither Eric Gray nor Marcus Major. And Oklahoma has a guy coming in as an incoming freshman, currently with the team right now as an early enrollee, that I absolutely love. And that in my eyes was easily one of the top 3 running backs in the 2022 recruiting cycle. That's Javonte Barnes out of Desert Pines High School in Las Vegas, Nevada. Barnes was a guy that had a lot of interest in USC, had a lot of interest in Alabama, had some interest in Florida State. But the ties with DeMarco Murray, obviously being a fellow Vegas native, really put Oklahoma in an outstanding spot to secure his commitment. It kind of dragged out a little bit into the month of January. He committed at the Under Armour All-American game. But that was a phenomenal late addition to this recruiting class for Oklahoma because Barnes is one of the most dynamic runners that you will see on tape as you look at his high school film, and particularly when you look at his peers in the 2022 cycle. I'm not convinced that pound for pound there was a better running back in the nation in that recruiting class than Javonte Barnes. And early returns on him throughout winter workouts have been outstanding. You think back to what Trey Sermon did as a true freshman for Oklahoma in 2017. I think Barnes is a guy that can have that type of impact. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say he immediately supplants Eric Gray and Marcus Major to be the week 1 starter at Oklahoma at running back. But what I do think is there's going to come a point in time at which it's going to be very, very difficult to keep Javonte Barnes off the field. I go back to Marvin Mims in 2020, for instance, when he came in as a true freshman and in a loaded wide receiver room at Oklahoma, nobody really paid much attention to this 4-star true freshman out of Frisco. But lo and behold, he comes out, catches 3 touchdown passes over the season's first 2 games, and you see his snap count gradually start to increase. And by the end of the season, he's commandeered 70 to 80% of the snaps, and he's making big plays in the Big 12 championship and the bowl game for Oklahoma. I think Javonte Barnes can be that type of guy in 2022. He can be what Marvin Mims was in 2020. He can be what Trey Sermon was in 2017. I would expect that ultimately Barnes ends up with 500, 600 rushing yards at the very least, and is good for a handful of touchdowns. I think his ceiling is much, much higher than that. If he proves that he is on a different physical level and he's clearly more capable of shouldering the load in the backfield than Eric Gray and Marcus Major, and I understand it's a big hill to climb to get there, but I do think that if he ends up getting the lion's share of the carries, if he's getting 70 to 80% of the workload, his ceiling could be north of 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. So that's one guy I'm really looking for to make a splash in 2022 as a true freshman. And it's not often that I would tout a true freshman as somebody who's going to have an immediate impact, but I think Javonte Barnes is that kind of player.
Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk come into the program as 2 4-stars with top-end speed. They're both roughly top 100 players in the nation, according to 247 Sports, both top 10 running backs. So I've got to ask the question, Parker, why you side with Barnes, where Sawchuk, according to the 247 rankings, is slightly better, at least at this point, coming into college.
Yeah, sure. Well, 2 reasons here. One, Barnes is enrolling early. Gavin Sawchuk is not. And I don't know if people understand how much it benefits a player to have an extra semester on campus before his first season hits. When you join the team in January, as opposed to joining the team in June, you get to go through winter workouts. You get to go through spring practices. You get to start learning the offense and getting to know your peers and building relationships that can generate big returns on the football field. And so Javonte Barnes has a natural leg up over Gavin Sawchuk in that capacity, just by virtue of the fact that he's on campus right now and Gavin Sawchuk isn't. I also think Barnes is more physically ready for the collegiate game than Sawchuk. If you look at their frames, Barnes is a guy where he stands about 6'1", 190, but he's built. He's muscular. You stand next to him, which I have on the field at Gaylord Family Oklahoma Memorial Stadium. I got the chance to catch up with him briefly when he was on an unofficial visit it might have been his official visit in the 2021 season. Regardless, he's a guy where you walk up to him, he seems a lot bigger in person than he does when you look at pictures. That's a guy that's ready to play Power 5 football from a physical standpoint. Gavin Sawchuk is a guy that's a little bit more slightly built, and I would say probably needs a year in the weight room before he's ready to be a 2-3 down type of guy at the collegiate level. Not to say he can't contribute right away, but I think Barnes' body type and his physique, as well as the physical tools that he brings to the table, are more conducive to having that immediate impact